Merhabalar, hoş geldin.
And we also hope and we know that there are people watching us outside of Istanbul and even Turkey. I would like to make some remarks on the live broadcast. Our panel is broadcast on YouTube currently. If there are people who do not want to be seen on camera, please let it be known by the technical team. I'm Özlem Kaya. I know a lot of you, but I would like to introduce myself all the same. I started in Hafıza Merkezi Berlin 6 months after its establishment, and I worked in the memory and peace studies, which changed their name and focus from time to time. I'm one of the founders of Hafıza Merkezi Berlin, and since 1 year and a half, I'm the director of the association. I would like to introduce also my organization. We established Hafıza Merkezi Berlin in 2018 in Germany. Among its founders are the founders of the Hafıza Merkezi İstanbul, which has been operating in Istanbul for 10 years. As we all know, authoritarian regimes have been at work on a global scale lately, and racist and sexist movements are getting stronger. This is why we decided to think about the struggles we could have against these movements, and we wanted to take a stand against these movements internationally. We see that in different countries there are these trends, and we wanted to know. We knew that we had to struggle together also internationally against these racist and sexist movements. And this is why we created Hafıza Merkezi Berlin. This was our perspective. And from the beginning, we were in partnership with Hafıza Merkezi İstanbul. But as Hafıza Merkezi Berlin, we also had our own programs and subjects of research. From the beginning, we were interested by this gendered gendered side of this struggle and these attacks on women and LGBTQI rights globally made us work on that. The first project we had was in Poland, Hungary, and Turkey. We prepared comparative reports, and we were interested by sexist policies of the state. And we had meetings with women and LGBTQI movement actors. And from the beginning, we had this issue of gender in our head. So in the process, we also started to work in civil space and human rights movement. We wanted to discuss about that. And with this objective, we have conducted some researches in the framework of a project. We are going to present you the results of these researches. As a lot of you know, who are here, of course, actively we people who are working in human rights field are especially women. And in Turkey, there is a strong LGBTQI and feminist movement, but this question is not genderized a lot in Turkey. This is what we have seen in the analysis, in the policies. We don't, institutions don't see the gendered side of it, or they don't have these projects. Our struggle, our work, in our struggle, in our work, gender should be a subject, and we see that patriarchy is not that much considered in this field of human rights. And these questions are not considered enough. Feminist movement and LGBTI plus movement, some parts at least, have also this distance and critiques against the human rights field. Of course, we shouldn't ignore that. And in the same time, we see the field of civil society and human rights as an undisputed safe space, because we are comrades and we are fighting together against a great oppression. We are really comrades and friends. And it is a field we see as a family, close, claim to be close and safe. But we know, thanks to the feminist struggle that has been ongoing for years, we know that precisely that it is very necessary to problematize and even destroy these families, quote unquote families, these acquaintance, this idea of being in the same boat, struggling against the same things for a lofty purpose, make some issues invisible. And there are sexist structures that transcend gender blindness in the field of work and struggle. This is on this subject that we wanted to focus on in this project. And we wanted to talk about these issues. We wanted to discuss the gendered structure of civil society and human rights that has been rendered invisible. And we decided to start talking about the experiences of women, queer and non-binary subjects working in the field. We started to work on these issues last March, and we started from the concept of women right defenders, human right defenders. The paradigm of human right defender has brought a set of concepts that we encounter more and more frequently in Turkey lately. And we are using these, and I will not go into the details of this because Duru's report And the historicity of her report talks about that. There is this debate, and in a more global scale, feminist critiques exist also against the human rights idea. And so we started from the concept of women human rights defenders, and we wanted to have these debates in Turkey, in the framework of Turkey. But this was only a starting point. We took this concept, but we didn't limit ourselves to its internationally accepted definitions. By means of this concept, we tried to genderize this field: human rights advocacy, advocacy itself, politics, professional civil society studies. In other words, the different structures, subjectivities, and positions of the civil sphere, which are now more diversified. We did this with a team of 5 women. Özgür Sevgigöral took part in this project as the consultant of Hafıza Merkezi Berlin and this project. I was on the team that carried out the project, and our research team consists of Duru, Gülistan, and Hande. For this research, we interviewed 30 people from non-governmental organizations, feminist movement, Kurdish movement, women's movement, LGBTI plus institutions, and activist networks. Duru, Gülistan, and Hande made the interviews mostly. Due to the fact that our research team is in different places of the world, and due to the pandemic, the interviews were conducted online by following semi-structured questionnaires. But we fixed the interviewees together. We tried to create a diversity altogether by considering criteria such as age, gender identity, sexual orientation, work area, working style, belonging styles. As much as we could, we tried to have this diversity in our minds always. We carried out this study. Well, at the time, I mentioned at the beginning, the policy making was difficult. The pressure on civil society activities and employees was increased. We pursued the question of how women experience this effect in their daily professional political lives. We do not act from a place that equates gender with women, but we focus on women's experiences by seeing the binary gender structure of the heterosexist patriarchal system, which are forced on these experiences and makes them difficult. We had 2 people that were interviewed that described themselves as non-binary. We tried not to ignore their experiences, but only 2 of 30 were non-binary, and these 2 interviewees alone were not, of course, enough. We think that we have to work on that experience, non-binary experience, especially separately. And 3 researchers wrote 3 reports and had the same number of interviewees. You can see the reports outside on our table. And I wanted to note one thing before giving the floor to my colleagues. We had some questions in our head. Duru, Gülistan, and Hande not only answered these questions, but also brought a more profound point of view with their own questions. They enlarged the scope of the research, and during the whole process, the feminist method was our guide in the design and in the dynamics of relations among ourselves. Considering our different ways of lives. We were really very much in solidarity together, and I would like to thank them for their kind ways of working. And I didn't introduce you one by one when I started. Maybe you can introduce yourselves before starting. Hande can't be here with us. She's in Paris. And we are going to start. So with Duru, hello. Thank you very much for coming. I am a little bit excited because I'm with all these people who, with whom I started to work in this field. I'm really honored to be here. I thank Gülistan, Özlem, Hande. It was a great team. We really worked well together. I finished law school. After finishing law school, I started to work in Hafıza Merkezi in different positions. And now I'm working in Berlin. And the report I wrote in the framework of this project, and the title of this presentation is the Gendering the Struggle for Human Rights and the Feminist Debate, mainly. During this research, we looked at the human rights discourse, the protection mechanisms, but I wanted to have another stamp of feminism, of gender on that. We wanted to look at that from a gendered perspective to human rights struggles. Are these mechanisms really satisfying for women's needs? Are these enough? As Özlem said before, human rights defenders' discourse and the mechanisms created around that. These are new concepts for Turkish civil society. These are not, of course, brand new concepts, but we can agree that these latest years, and since 2015, we've had this atmosphere change, political atmosphere change in our country, and the oppression on civil society, the attacks, the threats, and the right violations made that we started to use more and more these concepts, and we were shaping our discourses also from the human rights perspectives, and we gave more references to these ideas. And in our projects, in our campaigns, in our solidarity networks, we included this discourse, human rights discourse. And of course, in Turkey, all the people who are working in the civil society, civil field, civil society, NGOs, human rights defenders, institutions and actors and associations, and the struggle itself should be sustainable. In order for them to be sustainable, locally in Turkey, we created local protection mechanisms. We developed projects, but also we had some projects in UN or in EU or AGID. We started using these mechanisms, human rights defense mechanisms, more and more, and we had closer relations with international organizations working in this field, and we also took advantage of their means also, these international means also. And a good part of the demands are really structured on human rights discourse for right now. And for a while, in different levels, these are going to be shaped that way on human rights discourse. So even if we like it or not, we agree or not, even if we want to go beyond this notion, this concept, and we criticize this, we are going to work with that concept for a while. Because we see that in Turkey, this oppressive atmosphere in our country, human rights, we need human rights, we need these protection mechanisms, more or less. And at that point, as feminists, we shouldn't leave any space without gender, and we might not feel belonging to this discourse, but we don't have this luxury to leave it alone, leave it to itself, leave it without any gender perspective. So we have to see this gender perspective. We have to have this gender perspective. Some actors, women are attacked, LGBTQI people are attacked because they are working in this or that field, in this or that rights advocacy mechanisms. We have to protect them, and we have to see at which level these mechanisms, protection mechanisms, are enough or satisfactory for non-binaries and women. We have this responsibility. I think if these mechanisms are not enough, we have to improve them. For my report, at least, I was departed from this idea of responsibility. And from this point of view, feminist point of view, what are we seeing in human rights defenders' mechanism? Is it gendered already? We know that if you leave it alone, no space is going to include the gender perspective by itself. And these questions follow then. These mechanisms, these networks we are creating, these projects we are developing, are they taking into consideration the experiences of women and non-binaries on the field? Their different experiences compared to men, different attacks on them compared to men, different ways of experiencing these attacks, and different protection mechanisms they might need because they are non-binary and women or women. So these questions are in front of us. These mechanisms, are they accessible in practice for women? This is the question that led me on. And in order to answer these questions, I wanted to see how other feminists from other countries, other geographies are criticizing these mechanisms, these protection mechanisms, and how are they trying to transform and genderize these mechanisms. And at the end, my objective was to say, is this feminist experience we started to use little by little, can help us, can lead the way to transform these human rights discourse and fields with this feminist discourse. What are the feminists saying? What were the feminists saying around the world? How were they criticizing these mechanisms? Since 1990s, they are, since more than 20 years, they are criticizing this discourse and all the mechanisms created around protection mechanism created around this discourse. Feminists say that this regime, this protection regime, is putting in their center the experiences of hetero cis men living in Western European countries. So they don't respond to the demands of women or non-binaries. And they make these demands invisible. So in 3 points, they say that in 3 points, women have different experiences. Because first of all, they are not only attacked because they are right defenders, because they are attacked because they are women only. What I mean by that is that women, when they defend rights, they also give birth to gendered violations. For example, every right defender can be attacked on social media, but women are attacked in a sexist way with sexist insults, sexist threats, talking about sexual attacks. So this is different. And second, feminists say that maybe women experience the same violations, for example, judiciary violations. They are arrested as men, human rights defenders, but their experience is different because of their gendered in society. When they go to prison, the amount of support she will need will be different. And thirdly, it's not because of their gender, but because of the ideas they defend also, that they are attacked. A lot of right defenders talk about LGBTI plus rights, rights on reproductive rights, and they are working on these rights, and this is why they are attacked, and they merit another approach of protection. And these mechanisms are not enough. Existing mechanisms are not enough. That's what the feminists were saying. The protection regime and the ideas of risk, security, victim, attacker, all these notions and concepts should be redefined in from a gendered perspective. And women rights defenders, where does that come from? Özlem talked about this definition in the beginning. Feminists, when they are criticizing, in order to criticize and in order to make their ideas visible, in UN, when they are criticizing this protection regime, they are using the term of women rights defenders. They were saying that women rights defenders are having different experiences than right defenders. So feminists are using this term strategically, and with this strategical point of view, they make visible the different experiences on the field of women right defenders.
So, from this view, from a feminist perspective, when we took a look at the protection mechanisms, and we have listened to the feminist criticisms. So, how can we implement this in practice? I mean, in practice, this feminist perspective. When I'm talking about protection mechanisms, I'm talking about something very broad. Solidarity networks, the projects we develop, etc. I'm using this term in a very broad sense. So how should we transform these protection mechanisms? So I will mention a few points here, and I will leave the microphone to Gülistan probably. First of all, one of the greatest criticisms is that rights defenders on the field, the greatest attack come from state-based violations, arbitrary detention, judicial harassment, torture, etc. So these are the greatest threats, and these should be handled first. Of course, to some extent, this is true. But in addition to that, women on the field, private companies, media companies, criminal organizations, or people who see women rights defenders as a threat to tradition and religion. So attacks from these structures to the women human rights defenders might be rendered invisible. So, like Özlem mentioned, women human rights defenders are subjected to attacks from their private circle, family members, colleagues, friends, etc. This also renders those threats invisible. And in my opinion, during this study, one of the most important findings, in my opinion, is this. If you focus on state-based violations that much, then you might miss some threats coming from within the field, from our colleagues or from our surroundings. So we have to think about this together, because I think we have to keep this in mind. all this human rights defender discourse and protection regime is based on this logic. Defending human rights and continuing these activities is really important for democratization, human rights, rule of justice, etc. You can agree or disagree with this, but this is the logic behind it. But to fulfill this important role, to make sure human rights defenders are able to fulfill this role, we have to be able to ensure an environment in which they are able to protect their physical and mental health. We have to develop such protection and support mechanisms so that rights defenders will be able to continue their activities within the human rights field. They shouldn't be excluded. They shouldn't be forced to stop their activities in this field. From this perspective, of course, arbitrary detention, judicial harassment are some of the obstacles in front of the activities of these people. But during our study, we have realized that female rights defenders basically are forced to leave the field due to internal attacks and threats, mobbing, sexual harassment, and many other things can be included among these. Gülistan will probably go into the details of this in her report and presentation, but I can say that this is the most fundamental thing. The second issue, in fact, it's connected to the first point. When we focus on the state-based violations, and we think that physical protection of human rights defenders is priority number one. Preventing torture, physical violence, or imprisonment of human rights defenders forms the center focus of our strategy. Therefore, according to our findings in our study, women are subjected to emotional, psychological violence during their rights defending activities, and sometimes these threats might have worse impact than some physical threats. So we have seen that women that we interviewed are working in very harsh conditions, and they are not economically compensated, and their economic situation is difficult. They almost all of them are depressed, or they have burnout syndrome or anxiety. Most of them use sedatives, medication, and most of them need therapy. Instead of campaigning about rights defenders, sometimes giving a grant for therapy might be a more meaningful method of protection, that I can say. So when feminists are criticizing this protection regime, they think that security should require a holistic approach. Psychosocial security and physical security should be considered together when determining the protection strategies. Another topic, again, it's in connection with the focus on state-based violations, because all this protection regime points at the state as the most horrible perpetrator, but against the state there are individuals. These attacks will be targeted at individual defenders, it implies. And this is not true, because rights defenders are unable to develop protection strategies against collective attacks. Again, another result of our studies is this: the most disturbing, frightening attacks for women are not cases brought against them, but when the attacks extend to their near circle, their family, their friends. But there aren't enough protections in this regard, according to our study. And finally, I would like to say this: an attack suffered by a woman on the field, in fact, has a collective effect on all the women on the field, and we are also not considering this when we approach the issue on an individual basis. Of course, all this individualistic approach brings something else. It brings a sort of a heroism story. Most attacked rights defender individuals, we select them, and we are trying to we are saying that improving their visibility is the best way to protect them, awarding them, campaigning based on them, using their faces and raise awareness around their works, etc. We think that this will be helpful. But visible rights defenders, behind those rights defenders, there are people who are carrying all the burden and who are supporting them, and they are unable to take advantage of this support because we are using all our resources on that individual. So the feminists, when they bring their criticism, they emphasize that a collective protection approach should be adopted instead of an individualistic hero-based protection. And this requires actions that will empower all the women on the field, all the human rights defenders on the field, and that will make sure they are able to continue their activities while feeling safe. So we have to determine protection strategies based on this. I would like to finish my talk like this. I hope I didn't go beyond my time. Of course, this human rights defender paradigm and gendering this paradigm in Turkey is a long-term, multifaceted discussion, and discussing these topics within scope of the study. The only way to discuss this is not the notion of women human rights defender or human rights defender. Probably many other subjects who we were not able to reach during our study should be included. This is our hope. This is how we have started our journey. But at least this discussion will open doors to other discussions and will enable many different fields in which we are able to talk. This was our intent when preparing this report. Thank you very much. Before moving on to Gülistan, maybe you can expand on the first topic a little more. You mentioned it in the beginning, and also I tried to expand on the topic at the beginning. Our starting point, it's a little bit direct translation from English. It's women human rights defenders. That's the notion. But when we were starting, we were aware of that. This is not a very much known concept in Turkey. It's not even used strategically in Turkey. And none of the women we have interviewed, almost none of the interviewees, identify themselves with this concept, this notion. So based on this notion, what's the meaning of starting your journey based on this notion? Why insist on that? You can elaborate on that maybe. Yes, as I said, we have interviewed around 30 people, and we interviewed people with different profiles. Most of them, they don't identify themselves as human rights defenders, nor women human rights defenders. And most of them thought that they were not aware of the women rights defender notion as it's used in the study. They found this too Western, sterile, and foreign, and they didn't want to limit themselves in a concept created by a UN mechanism. Sometimes some of them said that they were uncomfortable with some other meanings of human rights defenders in Turkey. It's said that as if we are doing a holy, a transcendental job, but that's not the truth. They said, I am just a civil society worker. So you are right. People were not identifying themselves like that. So why are we trying to assess the situation of the women in Turkey based on this notion? It's a very correct, right question, because I ended my conclusion with this question because I feel bad. But I have two answers to this. First one I have given inside my presentation. The human rights defender notion and the mechanisms have entered into our lives. We are living with this. We are working on these topics, even though when we are not defining ourselves like that. We receive a therapy grant from an international organization So, as feminists, we cannot leave any field that we touch ungendered. This human rights defender notion, before it swallows the women in Turkey, we have to invade it ourselves. But this doesn't mean that. This doesn't mean this is a perfect notion, this is a perfect concept, let's use it, adopt it, and continue on this notion. No, we can keep our distance to this notion, to this terminology, but we can continue to gender human rights defense protection mechanism. And the second issue, in fact, is the notion of human rights defender. We are think about that on a discourse level. Do you identify as that, or don't you? But it's not just a discourse, because it also brings a network of protection mechanisms and support programs. And in fact, one of the feminists we interviewed said something, and it was really touching. I try to remember that all the time. And feminists' relationship with this human rights mechanism is a little bit problematic. We are trying to destroy family, and we are also trying to obtain right to alimony. We want to destroy patriarchy, and we want to destroy UN on the long term, but we also need a breathing space with regard to current attacks. We need some mechanisms that we can use right now. We can use it, women human rights defender, and we can obtain therapy grants. It seems like I'm obsessed with therapy grants, but it can be a campaign about us. Therefore, these mechanisms for us, for the women on the field who are trying to continue their struggle under pressure, in fact, this might help them to feel a little bit safer. This can help them to protect their psychological mental health a little bit more, and these mechanisms have the capacity to help them. So how can we use this capacity more effectively, more efficiently? I think this question is really valuable. So where did this notion came from, and how can we take advantage of this notion? I think these are meaningful questions. This is why we have followed up on that. Thank you very much, Duru. Now we will move on to Gülistan. Gülistan's report is titled Defending Rights Between Institutions, Identities, Subjectivities, a Gender Perspective on Civil Society. She'll talk about herself a little bit more. She focused on day-to-day experiences of the women. So thank you very much. Duru facilitated my job for me by putting some notions in right places. So I have to talk a little bit about myself. I studied sociology, and I am working in Hakikat, Adalet, Hafıza right now. First of all, thank you very much for being here today and listening to us, because this is one of the most important legs of the project. We wanted our findings to open a discussion in civil society, so it's really important that we are here today. So, in my report, I talked about the sexist structure of civil society and sexist practices in civil society. Before moving forward, I can quickly say this: why civilian field? In the report, I talk about civilian field, social struggles, and rights struggles. So I have to say that interviews come from very different areas. Being a part of a civil society organization, being a part of a grassroots organization, a feminist organization, a rights defender initiative, etc. These are very different experiences. So I didn't choose civil society. I chose civilian field as a more broad term. So different organizations of day-to-day life and political approaches in these different approaches. So all these experiences are built on a foundation. All the positions, all the approaches are really important in order to attribute meaning to these experiences. Therefore, these two main things are really important. First of all, I would like to share the plan of today's presentation. First, what was the fundamental problematic of the report and why I tried to focus on day-to-day experiences when studying this problematic, and and why we try to look at different organization types, because we didn't think about it at the first time. So examining day-to-day experiences and organization models will help me explain my findings. While I'm sharing my findings, I will also share our questions, because there are a lot of questions beyond the scope and intent of this research text. So while we are here, I would like to ask these questions to you also, and would like to get your opinion. And finally, maybe in the conclusion section, where can we move from here? What type of discussions can be continued? So I have some notes on that, and I would like to share them also. First of all, Özlem and Duru mentioned a lot. Looking at civil society here with a gender perspective, what's this? What kind of problem is this? Feminists have been saying this for a long time. We cannot understand state by separating public space, civil society, etc. These do not have clear distinctions. It's not that there's only state and we are subjected to a violence generated by that state. On the contrary, all the particles of social life, all the businesses we work at, etc., these are all recreations of the state violence. So we shouldn't separate these three fields from one another. We have to take into consideration their gendered structure, and we have to say that civil society is not free from gender violence. Also, there are some inequalities in the civil society, and we see that in our day-to-day experience in civil society, they are reproduced. And there is an objection which is really important in this report. The human in human rights, this is an abstract term, but it points at a white bourgeois male. But rights defenders, we interviewed right defenders, therefore in human rights defenders, the person whose rights we are defending is abstract white male, and rights defender is also imagined as a white male. So when we are building these mechanisms, what are we basing these mechanisms on? We have to see this. This is really important. So gendered practices, actions, and discourses of rights defenders are also important. And also, why day-to-day experience? Because day-to-day experience is continuous and repeating. Am I going too fast? Yes, a little bit. Okay. These are repeating and continuous acts, and these are produced in a concrete, tangible space and time by real individuals. These have real results, and these are produced with some mechanisms and things like that. So,
Çok somut anlamda
in a very concrete way, what does it correspond to? How is it recreated? How is it reproduced? What are the mechanisms? What are the patterns that are used when you reproduce these? And why? It is okay, there are inequalities, gender inequalities, but why should we also take into consideration the organization types and models? The inequalities people suffer from are those this doesn't mean that there aren't other inequalities. This doesn't mean we don't look at what are the problems of human rights defenders. We looked at what are they suffering from? What do they say they are suffering from, women? How do they exist? What are their problems? And when they are motivating their actions, also these changes, the organization models are important for this purpose. In the beginning, these inequalities, what are these different inequalities? Age, class, ethnicity might be inequalities. We have the gender inequalities in the other side and other inequalities in the other side. It's not like that. It's not that separated. This report is concentrated on gender and gender inequalities. When gender inequalities are produced, how are other inequalities becoming unfunctional? Age or LGBTQI persons inequality is suffering from. They are suffering from. Some are also suffering because of the age, some from because of their class, some ethnicity. So there is no inequality that you are suffering from alone. This is more complex than that. And the objective is, as there is no human rights defender, unique human rights defender, there is no unique women rights defender either. So different types of disadvantages should also rendered visible. In the first part of the report, I wanted to talk about the role of gender. Gender, is it still a problem? Is it seen, or this is the idea of this report? Maybe gender, if we were making this research in another field, we wouldn't need this title, but in civil field, as Özlem said it, we are suffering from different inequalities, violences, and we have this kind of a solidarity. But these were not. We were thinking that these are not very important. We don't have this in our organization's culture. We have these in our policies. There are these motivations. So at the beginning, I wanted to say, yes, gender is still an issue. And here I looked at who are we rendering visible, how are we rendering invisible, and who are we considering? Who is going to decide who is visible or invisible? It is a man's point of view. Sometimes it is about the existence of a woman or labor existence of an LGBTQI person, or a man can render it also invisible. And also some of the examples I can give from the interviews. One of the women we interviewed, she is working in this field for a very long time. She is in the struggle. She says that when she was in custody, the state violence, she talked about it a lot. And as she talked about it a lot, men colleagues said, you are talking too much about that. It's not adequate. You shouldn't talk about that much. This was the critique they were bringing to her. So the rights defender's image was not covering the behavior of this lady. So this was rendering her too much visible, so they didn't like it. That's what she said. And sometimes it can be also when there is a press conference, for example. Women are writing the report, but when the time comes to share this report with the public, women are sent at the back of the hall, and she has to struggle also to make her labor visible, to make her work visible. And another point was talked about by LGBTQIs, especially in a meeting, in the street. Their experience is rendered too much visible because too special, too with so many intricacies, so they are seen as marginal and different, so much different that they are made too visible. And when it is important to look at all the daily experiences, and Duru talked about that also. These are, it's not as if we were suffering individually from specific things. These are patterns and mechanisms we suffer from, each of us. And in the report, it is not being taken seriously. Instrumentalization and the genders effect that we are always being aware of. Maybe I can also detail all these to not be taken seriously. In a lot of women and interviewees, we have seen this. Sometimes it is against the bureaucracy of the state. A lot of women said that when they go to see an agent of the state, they are really paying attention to what they are wearing in order to be taken seriously. And it's not always from the hierarchy. Sometimes a technician can see in from another point of view, a technician in a professional hierarchy, a woman who is an administrative or a director in an association or organization, for example, cannot be taken seriously by a technician. And also, instrumentalization is another point in queer and feminist struggle. In organizations, for the sake of queer and feminist struggle, they can't just ignore the point of view of queer people and women. But women are saying things like that. There is this text that is written. At the end of the day, they call you, hey, can you look at that the night before? Can you look at that from the feminist perspective? Because they don't have this perspective. They just want to justify the text by showing it to a feminist woman. And they will say, we showed it to this feminist woman. She said, okay, so it's a feminist text. Now, there are these examples also they talked about. And formal and informal decision-taking processes also. It can also happen, it might not happen in a meeting room, for example. Women are excluded from the decision mechanisms when men are drinking rakı, for example, around the table, and they can exclude women, and women are also always aware of the effect of gender. Women or non-binaries are always remembering that they are here as a woman. In our interviews also, it was the same. They were remembering that they were there as a woman. They were talking about these hesitancies, these roles that were imposed on them, different roles. They remembered imposed on them. And also, for example, if there is a job I didn't do well, they are going to say it's because I'm a woman. She's sure of it. So she remembers this, she never forgets this, and she knows that it's never going to be forgotten. Duru talked about this also. In this field, women are really, really loaded with all this labor, emotional labor also, relations in the organization, outside of the organization. They are the ones taking care of these relations. They are the ones paying attention to these relations. This is also a kind of a labor which is completely not valued. This spiritual, relational labor. Sometimes also they are reminding things to men. They are completing the works that are not done by men. They are always in this position, women. So this load of work is huge. And there's also her own job, you know, and she says, what am I going to do between these two? I have this intellectual, spiritual, relational load. I have to make myself visible as a feminist. I have to make myself heard as a feminist, as a woman. I have to find my place, and I have to do my job. So they are always struggling. This is very concrete. They really don't have time to think about their job intellectually, what they should do, because they don't have time. They simply don't have as much time as men, and or they have to take time from their private life. And the question I wanted to ask you also, this emotional, relational load is a thing on which feminists are working, and there is also this maintenance economy, caring economy we are talking about, feminists are talking about. In our houses, we are caring of men, children, elderly, and what is the relationship between this caring labor and the relational, emotional labor that we are also exercising? We have seen that we are seeing this as a solidarity. We are also a little bit embellishing it, this labor, this caring, but we can also find other ways of solidarity and caring for each other without being exploited like that. And I want to talk also about organizations, organizing. Women are not victims of these different kinds of inequalities equally. It depends. It might be ethnic inequality, class inequality. But women, considering these points, women have different different ways of acting. It can be in a civil society organization. It can be a civil society organization which is founded on benevolent labor. This might be a field work, grassroots work, political work. And what we have seen as a separation point in the civil field is that in the civil field, you have remunerated labor and non-remunerated labor, and this makes a huge difference. If there is no remuneration, if it is a benevolent, if it is voluntary, women talk about their hearts, their sentiments, because they are here, because they like it, they give from their heart, and or as in order to exist as a political subject, I am here, they say. And for some women, it is also it's a struggle of identification, of identity for women. And in the other side, there is remunerated women, remunerated paid women, and they are professionally creating information and documents, and they are creating a political impact through the production of this information, this social information. So they are also saying that remuneration is very important for the sustainability of these fields and the sustainability of our own lives. And also, these two people's motivations are not very different, but what they are first talking about when they talk about themselves, these things are different. So some say they are activists, some say they are professional right defenders, some say they are political subjects. And here also, maybe we can also ask this question together. How are we remunerating which job how? We can ask ourselves these questions. Because women say that more and more these spaces become professionalized and a subject. it's not enough to exist as a subject. It's not enough to have this heart link with the organization. You have to speak English. You have to be able to write a report, for example. There are other qualifications that are necessary. And these are also things that organizations also pay for. Other than that, we see as if they don't need to be paid. But they are very important for the sustainability of these organizations. How are we paying which work and unpaid work, benevolent work, is done by women mostly, and how can we reconsider this from a gendered point of view, from a feminist point of view, the fact that these unpaid people are women mostly. And relations are also different, and very briefly, I might say that if there is voluntary labor or political struggle, what is urgent is very important in the field. Emergency is very important. But in the other side, when it is a paid job, there are strategies. Where is the civil field going? What is lacking in the civil society struggle? And this also itself shows us different ways of working and instruments. Some are in an office mostly, or some are more in social media or in the street. So relations are also different. Some are in the field, in the street, on the field, and seeing people, and some other people are mostly in relation with the founders.
Yani bu kadar fon verenlerin gündemi.
The founders, and also one interviewee talked about the danger of the expectancies of the founders. What do they expect from us? We have seen an interviewee from a trans organization. Sometimes founders might say, a council, for example, from a council of a country, yes, you can have this organization, this event, but is it possible that there be no sex workers? That kind of the idea. They are reproducing who is going to be legitimate in these meetings, And to finish, professionalism, human rights defenders, advocacy. How can we think about this? These differences of experiences sometimes, because in order to explain it analytically, I talked about two separate experiences, but it's not that separate. Some women are saying, here I am a subject in the political field, and here I am an employee in a civil rights organization. A lot of people are together in different fields, so they are not very different. Us also, we shouldn't forget these differences, and maybe we shouldn't forget the idea of political positions that we are adopting, and maybe we can think about the future from that point of view. Thank you very much, Gülistan. She finished with some questions. These are good questions, and we will give the floor to you also. I want to have some time to give the floor to our audience, so I will now give the floor to Hande. Hande's report is called Women and LGBTQI+ Actors as Lifelines of Each Other Relations, Alliances, Disjunctures in the Field of Human Rights.
You can hear me, right? Yes. I'm Hande. I studied sociology. I have been living in Paris for some time, and I'm working on my doctoral thesis here. First of all, I would like to say that I'm really excited, and I would like to thank Özlem, Duru, Gülistan, and Özgür. We had an amazing experience during this process, so I would like to thank you one by one. I cannot see the participants, but welcome also. I'm glad you are here. In fact, I will continue from where Gülistan left off. I will talk about gendering the movements, and basically in the report, feminist, LGBTQI pluses, and Kurdish women organizations. And I looked at their organization methods in human rights and where they leave these structures, organizations, their organization experiences, and interrelations in the field. This is what I try to look at in my study. Of course, the human rights field, when we talk about it, given its historical context and its struggle experience today, is a very loaded field, I have to say. Therefore, this report focuses on movements and relationship between movements. I mean, human rights movement and rights advocacy practice historically and contextually. It's not considered historically or contextually, but I have to say this maybe human rights movement is in the context of this study includes a struggle model, organization model, motion model, but this report didn't look at the movement from that perspective, but from a perspective sees that a struggle foundation with different facets. So when we talk about human rights field, it's a little bit fuzzy with what is included, what is not included. Therefore, when we are talking about human rights movement, the study prioritizes the forms of existence of these subjects in the field. This is what I tried to do in my study. As Gülistan mentioned, when conceptualizing human rights, the human refers to a cis, hetero, white male. Therefore, the subjects inside the human rights movement for many years, and today they are trying to change this meaning. And personally, what's important for me, and in fact in our reports and interviews, maybe it's a little bit hidden, but it's a really important issue in human rights, and it's animal freedom struggle and veganism. And they also bring some criticisms, and hearing their criticisms is really important. But of course, in this report, it had a really small place. But I hope we can create different studies within this context in the future. In the report, especially during the interviews, after 2015, almost all our interviewees mentioned the political conditions after 2015 by ending the peace process and increasing violence and war atmosphere caused by the state. And after the attempted coup in the 15th of July and with the state of emergency, all the fields shrunk in all our lives, and we are still feeling its impact now. And in the report, in the entirety of the report, the civilian field was harassed by the judiciary in the past few years, and the power strategies continued, and policy-making tools and organization methods of feminists and non-binaries and relationship between movements have changed, and we try to understand and discuss these changes in the report. Basically, I can say that in the report, in fact, if I talk about the structure of the report, fundamentally, Duru, Özlem, and Gülistan mentioned just now, this field, the focus is on gendering this area. In human rights movement, where's the position of women and LGBTQI pluses? Where do they see themselves, and what kind of relationships they build on that foundation? We try to understand that. And this report, we try to explain how they define this field based on interviews. I can mention that briefly. Since the 80s, feminists have been working together with human rights defenders, but there always have been a sort of distance between those fields. For example, until 2000, feminists, especially while moving within the human rights area, they say they specifically want to emphasize women rights, and with the negative. This is brought up by a negative womanhood discourse, but with increased partnerships with Kurdish women movement, etc., they start to talk about what this notion includes or excludes, for example, different sexual identities, etc. Based on this, we see some different movements within this definition. But in our interviews, in almost all of our interviewers said feminist LGBTQI pluses, impunity, state crimes, if they, even though they collaborate against those, but they are always intellectually separate, and they try to maintain these borders. So this intellectual difference is varied within itself, within the activist networks, within the groups. They form these differences with a sense of belonging. It can be struggle against cisgendered heteronormatism, patriarchy. It's not built from the same perspective, but this is a varied intellectual difference. As Duru mentioned, on the other hand, most of the time, especially feminist activist interviewers, even though they are moving in the human rights field, they don't see themselves, they don't describe themselves as human rights advocates, defenders. They insist on emphasizing that. And one of the important points here is that even though they do not identify themselves as human rights defenders, they say that they find it important. This means that this has a meaning for the feminist movement, especially during the 90s. By feminists, 90s were criticized by the feminists, but this field, institutionalization of civilian field, and the power strategies they were subjected to, because of those, this has turned into a field of struggle, and so human rights movement is important for feminists with regard to some common points. Even though they do not see themselves as part of this, in time they find themselves inside rights struggles. This is what I can say. This is what we have seen from the interviews. Another point, Duru mentioned it a little bit. The human rights field has a lot of loaded terminology. Prices were paid and people were subjected to legal harassment, and people resisted against this. This is what it is seen as. So it's seen as it has a historical responsibility. How can I put it? This is a sort of women, non-binary and queers position themselves a little bit far away from that, because when you say human rights activism, what people understand is since 90s until today, missing people, impunity, etc. And activity modalities brought by those are coming into mind. And even though they are in this movement, due to the weight of that price, they can the price historically paid in this field, they define themselves a little bit outside of the area. And another different point is that it's something that feminists agreed upon, is that human rights organizations have mixed organization models mostly, and feminists have been demanding this for many years, their own organizations, networks, they try to build them outside these mixed organizations. And in that sense, maybe it's a little bit a familiar argument, but it's important in a sense, in my opinion, because in interviews, when we talked about mixed organization model, it comes to this usually. Lately, with the new generation of feminists, with the social media, now in the past, cis-hetero males' actions that were hidden in the past are now revealed and talked about more. And most of these people, or some of these people, are from within the human rights movement. Therefore, in fact, this is an important thing. It's not only because cis male are included in mixed organizations. It's the demand for a separate organization was mentioned frequently in our interviews. From the perspective of subjects within the LGBTQI and non-binary organizations, there is an important point. They said LGBTQI pluses had a visibility in Gezi protests, and they were seen by the human rights movement after these events. This was one of the arguments. And even though they were visible due to those activities, their inclusion was only representative on the paper. And this was one of the criticisms. And there was something we have seen in the interviews. Feminist and LGBTQI plus movements, when they describe their relationships, it's a few interviewees mentioned this without knowing one another. They said this is a process of learning from each other. The relationship between feminist and LGBTQI plus movements is an experience of learning from each other. And when we look at this, LGBTQI plus movements and human rights field are still learning from each other, and we can say they didn't even start learning from each other. It's only at the representative level on the paper. And this, in fact, the discourse and statements of human rights maybe are stuck in a cis-normative area, and maybe it's not problematized enough. This was one of the criticisms from interviews, and movements, ways of contact between each other. There is an important implication, because a sort of distrust increases a lack of communication, especially after 2015. They see each other, but they have a distance between each other. This is how these fields are defined. So this lack of communication was brought up by many of the interviews. This lack of communication, in fact, it's not about the production of different networks which got a discourse. It's about lack of definition of a foundation on which people stand together in solidarity. So the idea of affinity and moving away from affinity, moving away from standing side to side on a common foundation is what is lacking, according to the interviews. It will not be a surprise, but after 2016, the civilian space started to shrink, and the pressure operation increased, and power strategies focusing on security was in the forefront, and groups, networks, activist groups, their discourses and their gathering methods radically changed, especially with regard to feminist movement. Maybe we all already know. In the past years, we were familiar. Feminist groups were disbanded. New networks grew from within them. So it's sort of like a changing of the skin. this also causes a radical change in policy making methods and forms. And even if we think on this, we don't have the opportunity to discuss it with each other. This is what was brought up by the interviewers. For example, before the peace process was ended, feminists who took peace in the center, or LGBTQIs who put peace in the center, they were organizing many joint seminars, but they are moving far away from that from now. So losing certain spaces caused these movements to turn into themselves, to become introvert, and to prioritize their own survival. And this, in fact, their own survival strategies being prioritized had an effect on more fragile groups and movements. They are targeted more frequently. Of course, this is not the only reason, but the joint movements in the past are unable to be a resistance in the face of the events happening today. So this was seen in our interview. For example, the Kurdish women movement, people from within the movement, from around the movement, many media, many spaces in which they got together are pressured, oppressed, based on struggle against terrorism. So when they are trying to survive, they are unable to build a joint network and solidarity. So they are unable to stand next to each other. Of course, it's not due to a lack of desire to be together. The street is becoming more and more impossible. Public space is closed and locked down, sort of, now. And getting together in a public space, it becomes impossible, unfortunately. However, no matter what, even if it's limited, movements are trying to see each other, of course, and we have to mention this also. For example, today, co-chairs and representatives in prison, solidarity with women activists in prison, visitations, etc. Even though they are not visible enough, feminist, LGBTQI plus movements, different subjects, they get together and they try to create contact points and try to see each other. But as I mentioned during the interviews, we have also heard that frequently, in general, people are in their own field and they prioritize their own safety and their own survival and existence. This is the situation, I might say. And another section talks about the shrinking spaces. How can we define shrinking spaces? And when we make this definition, women and LGBTQ lives, day-to-day lives, and professional activities, how did they change? We try to understand that with our questions. In our interviews, what we have seen is that in the last few years, when creating policy, when trying to move together, there are three priorities. There are three things they were exposed to. First is, I already mentioned in the beginning, the foundation of the report is the changes after 2015, political situation after 2015. We have to keep that in mind. And power strategies, surviving strategies, and the ways the movements see each other. So from that perspective, one of the important issues is the appointed inspectors. When we take a look at the Kurdish women movement, they have a central role, and we try to see this in our interviews. We have seen this in Diyarbakir. We have seen this. We try to understand this based on the associations in Diyarbakir. So, from the perspective of activist women, there are a lot of losses. For example, when the first trustee was appointed to Diyarbakir, they first closed the women's centers, and after state of emergency was declared, many women were it's sent away with decree laws. And all the spaces built by women in Diyarbakir were closed, and this causes loneliness, closing into private spaces, and a feeling of anxiety. And here in our interviews, I've seen an important criticism. In fact, struggle against trustees, appointed trustees, and security policies is a feminist struggle. However, this was mentioned a lot. However, it is not generally accepted by the movements. It was neglected by the movements. This was emphasized a lot. We are at the end of 2021, and 2016 seems so far away. But these state of emergency practices and the continuity of trustees, appointed trustees, they still continue, and especially Kurdish women. With these dramatic, radical changes in their lives, they are trying to find a way to struggle. And basically, they talk about loneliness. Beyond the loneliness, I can say this. They say this: the effect of this continues, and it's not understood. And this continuity is not understood by the movements. And standing against security policies and appointed trustees, why it is a feminist movement. It's not understood, they said. I think this is really important. And on the other hand, again, in our interviews, when we take a look at these shrinking spaces, another point that we have seen is that it's something that an interviewer said. She described these years as years that are transferred to the field of human rights. Even though women define themselves as activists, feminists, etc., inside the flow of life, sometimes a person can find herself within a struggle. And different women explained their own personal experiences. For example, a lawyer looking at feminist cases, or a journalist who is looking at women news, and in time they found themselves as a subject in the field of human rights. Especially historically, this is a time of intersection. For example, for a lawyer, these basements might be triggering. For a journalist, women murders might be triggering. So we have seen this activism, occupation, policy making. Borders of these have been blurred in the past few years. We can say this, especially women and queer people who are moving within these fields. We have seen that it has become impossible to differentiate between these fields. And I would like to add this. When we take a look at this period, based from a view to the peace process, there's a report, and this report and that report look at each other in some way. Intersecting pets and shrinking fields is the name of the report, and in that report you can see a perspective from the peace struggle on this process, and their bullet points and our bullet points sometimes intersect, so it's important. And finally, another topic in the issue of shrinking spaces, it's about inspections in civilian field, in the public field, paid workers or voluntary workers. Everyone knows about this process. In December 2020, there was a really weird law about mass destruction weapons, etc. The issue of audit. This was also brought up by women and queers working in this field. The issue of audits, of course, it's an intervention in the civilian field, but one of the interesting points is that especially after 2016, the street has become impossible, increasingly impossible, and the degree laws, etc. Activists, rights advocates were excluded from different public spaces, and civilian space was seen as an opportunity. For example, academics were excluded from the academia, or young next generation feminists, etc., came together and they started to form different associations, foundations, and networks. And the wave of audit, its perception was at the same time, it was seen similar to the violence we can be subjected to while on the street. And on the other hand, we have to say this also, the ways that people were impacted by audit are very different. Not all the subjects were affected by the audit wave to the same extent. For example, LGBTQI plus associations, Pembe Hayat, for example, are unable to do anything due to these audits. It's seriously as a punishment strategy. The audits are used as a punishment strategy. And finally, it's not finally, but finally, here within this framework, an interviewer said, for a long time I feel that I have lost my joy, and my friends with whom I have been struggling, they feel the same way, they said. And we have heard this in many different interviews. People who have lost their joy, and people who are looking for a way out, and people who are looking for opportunities to stand together. This is the point we are at. Therefore, especially after 2016, the government strategies, power strategies came wave after wave, with audits, with appointed trustees in different forms. In time, somehow, it caused a weakening in contact channels between movements, and movements activists prioritized their own safety and existence and survival. So losing their joy also points to this, and we have seen this in all the interviews. Even if people are describing a situation, but they also say that after political situation relaxes, they will get together again, that there's a hope of getting together again. It seems a little bit dark and pessimistic, but in my opinion, it's not pessimistic. I don't think it's pessimistic. I think we shouldn't be pessimistic. While we are talking about this, we also talked about new tools, new models, new organization experiences. For example, today, yes, maybe spaces in which we can get together, the streets, etc., they are very limited today, but different models of standing together are developed. For example, the digital media provides an opportunity beyond our imagination. It's more anonymous, and it's sort of disrupting the authority, and it provides a broader talking area. It enables people to directly tell their experiences. For example, we have Susma Gitsin platform, and we have other movements, exposure movements, new queer feminist discussion areas, and feminist discussion areas, etc. So the digital media may be seen as a new public space for the movements. And in our interviews, we can also see that it was emphasized. It was emphasized with this perspective. Maybe it was not emphasized like this for a long time, but for some time, maybe in the past, issues that were more discuss in literary areas or private discussion spaces, these move to the social networks. For example, in 2016, there was discussion about what the category of women encompasses, and discussion continues, and we have also included this in the report. I think this is important because during the interviews, while talking, this really surprised me. In a question we asked after 2016, feminist movement, LGBTQI plus movement itself, and their existence in these movements. What would you say about your existence? We asked, and here we mentioned after 2016 oppressive policies of the state, shrinking civilian space, etc. While we are talking about that, on the other hand, I think that triggers many women and queer people, trans feminism, queer feminism discussions, etc. These are as important. This is what we have seen during our interviews. Because that point is important, because especially not only in Turkey, in different countries, for example, we discussed this in Hafıza Berlin, anti-gender movements and right populist movements increased in different countries. So we also see fundamentalist discussion within the feminist movements. We see this in Europe and also in Turkey. And this itself recently, for example, one of the fundamental axes was reduction of gender to biological sex, and trans feminism, queer feminism, and moving together with the feminist movement, etc. I think today for feminist movement and LGBTQI plus movement, it's a great opportunity, the discussion itself. And from the perspective of the women we have interviewed, this was also brought up, I can say. It was a little bit triggering, but feminism becoming more queer, movements becoming more queer and moving together and increasing the spaces in which they get in touch with. In that regard, the discussions continuing on the digital space is really important, especially this year's 25th November walks and 8th March walks are looking much more similar to a pride walk, and it causes these movements to see each other. And as I mentioned before, being unable to create spaces and getting together in certain moments, certain days, this can be seen as a handicap still. Finally,
aslında biraz
Fundamentally, I don't know if I've been too long. If I can't hear anyone, I can't see anyone. I'm talking and talking. You can wrap up, Hande, please. So what I can say is that even if there are these disjunctures and there are these possibilities in this situation I described, I think that what we need is to see each other more, hear each other more, bring breath to each other more. This is what we have to build up, I think, and when we look at this report, we see that the main need is this. And in my report, there are things I've talked about in my report, and I didn't talk about it here. And I was so excited, I maybe forgot some points. So maybe this will be a subject for the questions and answers. Thank you very much. You have seen these presentations, and you have seen that you might imagine what all we wanted to have on these very small reports. It's really unfinishable. You should read the reports. I would like to thank you. I would like to now give you the floor, to the audience, to people I can see, and also to people who are listening on YouTube. There is one question already. How can we reach these reports? How can we have these reports? Now we have our reports on our website, Hafıza Merkezi Berlin website, in English and in Turkish. You can have access to these reports. And also on social media, on Twitter, and on Instagram, you have our website address. If there are other questions from people listening online, I will see those. But if there are people who want to take the floor here, a comment, a question. So it was too clear. Can you hear me? Yes. Congratulations. For me, it was really a point of reference when I'm going to be working in the future in projects. These are things we are going to come back to. Really very well done. Very specifically, I have a specific question. The interviewees, this question of age or hierarchy. For the interviewees, when you had these activists in professional civil society, especially, but in the other side also, this question of seniorness, was it distributed well in your interviewees? And when you look from this point of view of the seniors, do you have another story? Hello. These were really great presentations. Thank you very much. And this was really interesting for us. And another thing, I took the floor just after Kerem because it's almost the same question. He says, he calls it seniorness, but are there differences between generations, between ages? Gülistan talked about it, but Hande and Duru also worked on that. Hande looked at that from the point of view of movements, and Duru from the point of view of critiques brought to human rights advocacy. And we call it in social sciences this intersectionalities, different exploitation types that are getting together, creating new inequalities, seniorness, education maybe might be another thing in activism, in civil society, being able to participate in some networks or not might be another point. Being closer or further from some power focuses, this symbolic capital, we might say maybe. Are there these differences between these interviewees? And also another question. When you bring it forward, are there differences in reactions to this thing that you bring forward? Or do they say, no, in human rights advocacy, we don't have these differences because we get along together. We are paying attention to that already. There are good mechanisms, or are they more reflexive like that in some ages, or is there a difference in from this point of view? We might maybe take these two questions, because these questions are similar. Thank you for your questions. These are very good questions. I will start with Kerem's question. Of course, when we were choosing people who were going to be interviewed, we looked at the we had seniors, but also we had younger people who were beginners, mostly in the field. And as you said, and as Gülistan talked about in her presentation, there was this intersectionality perspective. One woman, which is a beginner, doesn't speak English, doesn't come from a favorized class, social class. This is a huge problem. What I found in my interviews is that, especially in Turkey's human rights advocacy field, there is this structure similar to family, very traditional. These are organizations created by a group of friends. A lot of people are respecting these organizations. They really paid the price. These kinds of organizations are very well respected. When there are new women or a gay person coming to this organization, a beginner, a young woman, or LGBTQI, there has to be a huge struggle. And while they are struggling against the state, they are also struggling in the organization. These are not things that they don't talk about, of course. These in these organizations, they talk about that. Young people ask for more responsibility, or asking for their rights to be recognized. But when they talk about these points, these issues, one interviewee had said, I'm seen as a witch, creating always problems, trying to make her own PR. That's how I am defined, as I say, if I talk about these issues. Or they are afraid of being called that way, so they don't talk about it. Maybe Gülistan might talk about the daily experiences. So I leave you the floor. Yeah, you really explained well. Kerem, you are really right. These are not hierarchy structures, of course, unhierarchical structures, of course, but when they are creating these inequalities, where is this seniorness? Where is this age standing? Does it have a function? I have a very precise example. For example, when you create a word on some field, a man who is older, who is maybe very much seen in the organization, if it is a woman who is criticized, they say straight ahead that she's young anyways. There are limits to these reports, and we wanted to concentrate it to gender, to inequalities. What is the functions of this seniorness when there is this inequality created? But without even making any research, we can see that there are these hierarchies, seniorness questions that exist also very much so in the civil field. Maybe we can think also about the age and to whom you are giving which job. Who is oriented to which job? who is included in some spaces and not. And I will go to Özgür's question. Intersectionality, I didn't talk about it that much because maybe it's very hard to pronounce, or maybe we forget about things sometimes, but it is very important, you are right. Without talking too much, I want to think about one thing. When I prepared the presentation, I seen that a lot of people are complaining about the professionalization of the civil field, and I felt that as if it was a gentrified neighborhood. They don't feel themselves in their own neighborhood anymore. They don't feel home anymore. The older ones, they say, well, I don't speak English that well. I don't have these international networks. When I say these words, I can't articulate as well as them. And there is this, there are these differences, and women become even more vulnerable because of these inequalities. In some interviews, I've seen this very clearly. And even in a field in which you have to feel yourself at home, they don't feel at home. There was this quote, there are announcers for a job, and I say, oh, yes, they have this emotional link, and they are having all these relations, but they feel also that they can't work professionally in another way. Sometimes it's a political choice. Will I work and be paid, or will I work and not be paid? Am I a professional? Am I an activist? And sometimes these are corners to which people are pushed to. And there was also another interview. There was this person who was very much self-criticizing, and she said, now I am doing my PhD abroad, and maybe we are the ones who are defining where will the association go from here. And the people who have these skills decide on these questions. There are these inequalities and discriminations and hierarchies because others don't have these tools, simply. Hande, would you like to add one thing? Yes, maybe what Gülistan talked about, younger women and queers, they are seen as they don't know much, they don't know the field, they have these kinds of resistances. They say they have these kinds of resistances, and they, against these kinds of arguments, one interviewee was saying, there are meetings too long. You can't keep a young person in this hall for that much time. So, but when they criticize the long length of the meetings, they are also excluded there. And there are also reports that nobody reads. They talk about this also. So this language is too heavy, too loaded. The content is too loaded also. So this is a huge critique. I'm hearing myself sometime. Yes. So these are very hard reports, hard to read. Practical information, quick information is seen as unqualified. That's what they were talking about, younger people. And I think that it is true. When we are working on heavy questions, we think that we have to create contents that are as heavy, as loaded, and the important is not to share this with a maximum number of people. This is the impression they have. So this is a resistance point. When Gülistan talked about it, I thought about that also. And for the movements also, there are these critiques. Sometimes they say generations are not seeing each other, are not talking to each other. It's not negative. It's not a threat, I think. I think that it is positive to have a diversity in age also in a field. And from the point of view of young people, there are these critiques also, and we should think about it also. I can add that. Thank you very much. Yes, Asena and Olcay. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. I hope that everyone will read these reports. In Gülistan's presentation, I really felt one thing, completing work that men didn't complete, or arranging things for them. You talked about caring economy, and you talked about this taking care of each other. You've talked about the risk. But what is the risk? I didn't understand. I didn't get that. What is the risk? And Hande, you talked about the digital and social media. Aren't there any risks there also? Because we say that this is polarizing also. We are in echo chambers mostly, and we only see very scandalous contents from the other side. I see that there are possibilities, but I think that there are also threats in this field. This is my question for Hande. We can also take your question. I have one question. It's not a question, but I wanted to know if you debated on that together. When I looked at the reports, in Hande's report, there are the names of the organizations, and I can understand why they are used. But in Gülistan's report on organization models, for example, did you talk about that? Should we use the organization's names or not? I'm sure you talked about that, but I was curious about your discussions on this question, if you want to open up on that. Maybe Duru, you can answer that, and Gülistan and Hande will continue with the questions. Of course, we discussed a lot, and also we also thought, should we use their names, their positions, because names are and positions are also helping us understand some things. But at the end of the day, for the security of our interviewees, because of the political atmosphere we're in, and also we have to accept one thing, for a lot of people we interviewed, they prefer to stay anonymous because sometimes they are criticizing their relationships, their own organization. They are problematizing their relations in the organization. So they didn't want to have any retaliations. We didn't use their names. Only Hande's report have organization names, as far as I know. Hande had to use these because it was the relationships between movements and organizations. When she was doing that, she also paid attention, we also paid attention to not make it very obvious who is it from which organization. When I talk about caring economy and the risk, caring economy and the link with womanness, we have to think about that. We have to make it deepen this reflection. Of course, it is very valuable for the solidarity. These are very valuable practices and characteristics. But women, where they are, they always feel themselves as if they had to do these things. What are the risks to that, for example? This caring economy comes from family, and it originates from the family, taking care of your family, of your children, of the man. And we want to destroy family, as Özlem said, and civil society is seen as a family. But And they want us to, identify ourselves with the civil society organization because it's a family. But women have different roles, different obligations than men. We have to maybe problematize these impositions on us, and this has a link with this womanness idea that is imposed to us. Maybe when we think about this, we will also start to understand more why we are burnout. Because women are really crushed under these loads, and people feel really, really devastated and exhausted because of that. Women feel exhausted. Maybe more than a critique, we should talk about that among ourselves, because we have seen this in research. Even us, between three of us, our ways of interacting with ourselves. How can we create boundaries? Maybe we can rethink these boundaries. I don't know if this means anything. This makes sense. Hande? Digital media and the risks? Yes, I want to say also one thing on the anonymity. It was obligatory, an obligation. These are not feminist and LGBTQI organizations are not homogeneous. There are also struggles between these organizations. I had to name these organizations in order to understand better these dynamics. But as Duru said, we discussed this a lot, of course, and we wanted to, people are anonymous, of course, and we wanted to not make it too obvious who is from which organization. And the organizations we named are the organizations who are seeing themselves as a part of these movements. But we also paid attention to the anonymity of individuals. As there are a lot of people, I don't think it was obvious. And digital media and risks, of course, there are very interesting movements that make us excited, but we have to think about one thing. Everyone becomes a subject very quickly in social media and digital media. And those who talk about the private space, those who are denouncing harassment, they become subjects, and we don't have any protection mechanism for that. How are they going to be impacted psychologically, affected psychologically? How are they going to counter all these threats and attacks? We don't have any mechanisms in social media. Women and queers are becoming subjects all of a sudden, even despite themselves. And we have to find ways to protect these women. We think about that, but I think that we should think even more about that. But even so, it opens a huge space. In my opinion, social media is like another version of the street. This has potentials, this has contradictions, its own contradictions, problems, but we have to create these mechanisms to protect ourselves. When I think about the movements, I want to see the opportunities it offers to movements. But another point that is very important also is the point of protecting themselves or each other, or individually. Some might feel better individually on social media. And how can we protect ourselves? How can we protect each other? And also, as I talked about in my report, judiciary harassment are developed from your posts, from your tweets. So we are censoring ourselves. We are not saying everything clearly. And it is a risky space, like the street. It's a contradictory space. Like the street, maybe we can think about the protection mechanisms. I can give the ball to Duru. It's your domain, protection. Other comments, questions? I just wanted to say one thing. When I was listening, I'm coming from another field. I'm in the publishing business, and I see that a lot of the things are very similar. These big decisions taken around the rakı table. And when as I'm a woman, if I make a mistake, it is because I'm a woman. Or routine jobs, it's your job. Or you have to complete the work which is not done by a male colleague. It seems very pessimistic because it's the same everywhere, but in the same time it's not, because it's good to see that it's the same everywhere. It's reassuring to see that it's the same everywhere. So, I realized that I didn't ask this question to you before in order to underline also one point. When we started this research, this team, five women, have been in different political movements in different times. They have worked, we are women who have worked professionally and voluntarily in the civil society and political organizations. We have this experience also. We are asking about to our interviewees. We are also genderizing these questions very much so. And this is why it's not in order to learn things, but it's in order to talk together, discuss together. And it is a way of starting this discussion. And I want to know one thing. When we thought about that, that subject, that project, we thought about our experiences. But after the interviews, were there any things that surprised you, that were really very surprising, unexpected for you? It's a very hard question. Hande, if you remember something. For my case, it was not surprising, unexpected, but it was striking. After a while, I didn't see myself as someone who is doing an interview. I am just seeing women, talking to women, coming from other experiences. It's like a raising awareness meeting. I found myself in this situation, and in these interviews, I was struck by one thing. When we talk about after 2015, it is very hard to listen, and it is too hard to tell also. Our lives were really impacted by that, and we really don't want to talk about that. This is what I realized, because in order to survive, in order to continue, go on living, we have to just ignore these things and keep going. And that's what I realized. And it was sometimes as a therapy session, mutual therapy session. And in each meeting, when I had this question, the answers were really hard, striking. That's what I might say, maybe. It was not surprising. What was surprising was maybe each time cis heterosexual men, they really surprise me, always. This was surprising for me. These different, several strategies of cis-hetero men, really, they really surprised me by their way of existing and being in the interviews. That's what struck me most. And after I thought about it a lot, I will say one very short thing. I was concentrated on, as it is the title of my report, I was concentrated on rights advocacy. Do you have another kind of violation because you're a woman in rights advocacy field? And a lot of women say, no, I don't, in the beginning. And then all of the interviewees were the same. And after, when I opened up with the questions, she says, I have sexual threats. Do you have sexual threats? Oh, yeah, I have sexual threats, but they don't count it. Okay, I don't think that it's because I'm a woman, but when I think about it, police is really hitting everyone, but they call us whores when they are hitting us. Yes, you are right. So even if we are feminists, this is not innate. These things are not innate. We have to have this discipline to think about it and realize what we are going through, what we are living. That's what I wanted to share with you. Two things I thought about. As regard to our bodies, I realized that we don't see that. We don't exist with our bodies. We say this is a man, a very abstract man, but it's so real. In a lot of organizations, they don't have, for example, off days for menstruation period. This is something that is very important for us. Hormonal treatment or menopause or a woman who has a child or a person who has a child. These small things are not considered at all, as Duru says, when you first talk about it. Do you have another treatment, a different treatment? No, they say no. But our bodies are so invisible in this sense, so invisible. Our existences are invisible. And the second point is that one thing that struck me, a difference that struck me is that people coming from political movements were different than people coming from civil society organizations. This struck me really. Ethnicity, people who are coming from the field were very much aware of ethnic discriminations or class discriminations. In LGBTQI people also, it was very clear. But some people coming from civil society organization, they didn't think about that. They were not that clear. But when they go back to the spaces, when they think about the concrete jobs they are doing, work they are doing, they think about it. Who is deciding? Who is deciding? Who is going to write what? And what is the class and ethnicity of that in Turkey, for example? This was very striking. People from political organizations were very much aware than civil society organization people. People coming from the grassroots movements were much aware.
Dönüyorum.
I guess we don't have questions from the viewers online. There are some nice comments. Thank you very much. And thank you to to each of you for preparing these wonderful reports and your wonderful presentations. And I would like to thank you for coming all the way here and participating. And I would like to thank everyone who's watching us in front of their computers. And I would also like to thank our translators, interpreters for moving the opportunity to listen to us to outside of this room. And I would also like to thank to the technical team for making that possible. And I would like to say, if you are here and if you don't have to go right away, we are still here. We will continue talking and discussing outside the hall. Thank you very much.